Good afternoon. We're going to get started with the next presentation. Again, my name is Luke Booty. I'm with the research papers team here at MIT Sloan. It's my pleasure to introduce Joe Kuhn and his paper, Accounting for Complementary Skill Sets When Evaluating NBA Players' Values to a Specific Team. The presentation, as before, will be 20 minutes with about 5 minutes for Q&A afterwards. If you have a question, I'll be around to pass the microphone. So please join me in welcoming Joe Kuhn.
All right. Thanks, Luke. Okay, so the main idea of this paper is what I'm trying to do is assess how individual players' skills and tendencies fit with and complement the skills and tendencies of their teammates. And then what that then means for the value that player has to a particular team. And so there's examples all over of the league where the fit of a player is a big determinant of the value that player is going to bring to a team. So for example, Danny Green provides a lot of value to the Spurs as a three-point shooter. And he's especially valuable to that team, given the way he spaces the floor for them and how he complements Tony Parker as this drive and kick kind of point guard. On the other hand, you have a player like Omer Asik, who doesn't really provide that much value to the Pelicans, because essentially what he does, play defense, get rebounds, Anthony Davis does, and Anthony Davis does it better. Complementarities between players is also important when we're trying to assess how much of a player's individual production is due to the team that player is playing on and how much of that would actually be portable or transferable to another team. So a question you could ask is how much is J.J. Redick's production on the Clippers due to playing with Chris Paul and playing with two big men that draw a lot of attention inside? Or how much of Jordan Clarkson's production with the Lakers last year the product of being on a pretty bad Laker team where someone needed to take shots on that team and someone needed to score points. And then on the other end, you could ask a player like Greg Monroe, would he do better if he was on a team where that had better shooters, that could space the floor better for him, and that could improve his production? And then the kind of obvious example is with Kevin Love in Cleveland, who's, playing with two All-Stars, he's going to see a drop in his individual production. And so what I want to be able to do is we want to distinguish between how much of a player's performance is due to that player's individual, skills and his tendencies, separate from, the team that player is playing on. And so what I try to do in this paper is try to develop a new way to look at this idea of fit by looking at the complementarities or substitutability between different player actions, and then assessing a player's fit or their value based on players' tendencies to commit these actions that might be substitutable or complementary with the actions taken by their teammates. Okay, so there's three goals of this paper. The first one is to try to identify the substitutability between these different game actions. So it's pretty obvious, like when Russell Westbrook takes more shots, that's going to take shots away from Kevin Durant. But how much so? How substitutable are the shots that Westbrook's taking for the ones that Durant would have taken? Or rebounds. How much, if Andre Drummond's getting an extra 15 rebounds a night, how many additional rebounds does that actually add to the team? Is he taking many of those rebounds away from the opponent, or are you taking those away from his teammates? And then with that, I want to use that framework to then assess the value that a player brings to a particular lineup, taking into account these complementarities between these different player skills and player tendencies. And then the last part of the paper is to try to then evaluate whether these player complementarities are valued in the NBA labor market. Okay, so how do I do that? So I'm not going to go into too detail of the model here, but the basic idea is that I'm modeling a basketball game as a series of possessions, where each possession is this sequence of events that have the potential to generate points or value to the offensive team. And so this is just a very simplified version of that model right here. But the basic idea is that each of the 5 offensive players on the court can either shoot from a number of different locations on the court, they can turn over the ball in a number of different ways, or they can get fouled. And then based on what action is taken, there's some subsequent actions that, again, have the potential to generate value. And so with each of these potential player actions, there's a probability associated with that action. And so I model these probabilities as a conditional logit. And so the idea is that, so let's say the probability that Kobe Bryant takes a 25-foot shot. That's going to depend on 4 different things. It's going to first depend on that player's own propensity to take that action. Second, it's going to depend on his teammates' propensity to commit that action. So Jordan Clarkson's propensity to take a 25-foot shot. And then the substitutability of that action. So how much does the likelihood that Clarkson's going to take a 25-foot shot affect Kobe's probability of doing so on a possession? And then the third thing, it's going to depend on the player and his teammates' propensity to commit other actions and the substitutability between those different actions. So how much does the likelihood that Kobe or Jordan Clarkson take a 15-foot shot or shoot from within 3 feet or turn the ball over, how's that all going to affect the probability that he's going to get a 25-foot shot during a possession? And then the fourth thing is it's going to depend on the skills of the defensive player. So how much do the 5 defensive players on the court affect the probability that Kobe Bryant's going to take that 25-foot shot? And so players in this model are going to generate value in that they're each going to have these different propensities to commit these different actions. And then that's going to affect both the probability that they take an action and then the probability that their teammates take a particular action. And then that together is going to affect the expected points associated with each of these actions, which then ultimately affects the expected points per possession, which are found by solving this possession model on the previous slide. And so what I'm interested in using this model for is looking at, for example, when Steph Curry enters the game, how much does his production and the shots that he's going to take depend on who he's playing with at the time? Or on the other end, when Steph Curry enters the game, how's that affecting his teammates like Klay Thompson's shot attempts and how much production that they're going to get? And so that's what I want to use this model for. So the first thing so I estimate this model using play-by-play data. And so the first thing that we can get are these substitution parameters. And so this is a table of the parameters. And so what it's telling us is if you put in a player that's 1% more likely to commit the column event, what effect that's having on the probability that his teammates can commit the row event. And so I want to just go over some examples of what these parameters mean. So the parameter on offensive rebounds. So what's that telling us? It's telling us that if you put in a player like DeAndre Jordan, who's going to get an offensive rebound on about 10 percentage points more of the time than Blake Griffin would have, that's really going to only increase the team's probability of getting an offensive rebound by about 4 percentage points. And that's because a majority of the extra offensive rebounds that DeAndre is getting are really coming at the expense of his teammates rather than the opponent. Another really substitutable action is going to be forced turnovers. So if you put in a player like Russell Westbrook, who's going to get or commit a forced turnover on about 1 percentage point more of possessions, that's only going to increase the team's probability of committing a forced turnover by about 117 thousandths of a percentage point, so a very small amount. So what that's telling us is that a lot of the additional forced turnovers that players are committing are just coming away from their teammates, not actually adding forced turnovers to the team. And so that's telling us that forced turnovers have more to do with the defense rather than the offensive player that's committing them, other than the fact that Russell Westbrook probably commits a lot of them because he has the ball a lot more often. That's in contrast to something like unforced turnovers, which isn't as substitutable. So if you put in a player like DeMarcus Cousins, who commits an unforced turnover on about 1 percentage point more of possessions, he's going to increase the overall team's probability of committing an unforced turnover by 652 thousandths of a percentage point. And so what it's telling us is a majority of the extra unforced turnovers that Cousins commits actually do add to the unforced turnovers of the team. What about shooting? So let's say, for example, that Tyreek Evans takes a shot within 3 feet on about 10 percentage points more of possessions than Eric Gordon. What's that going to mean is that's going to mean that the team as a whole is going to increase their probability of taking a shot within 3 feet by about 6.6 percentage points. And so some of these additional shots that Evans is taking inside 3 feet are going to take away those shots from his teammates. But they're also going to take shots away from other locations. So it's going to decrease the probability the team gets a shot from a 2-point field goal from 16 feet out or farther by about 4.8 percentage points. And so that's a really large amount. And that's in contrast with other locations. So again, if we put in a player that's 10% more likely to shoot or 10 percentage points more likely to shoot within 3 feet, that's only going to decrease the probability of shooting a corner three-pointer by 32/100ths of a percentage point, so a very small amount. And the reason that is because those are very complementary events. If you have a player that's driving more to the basket to take those three-point attempts, it's going to draw in the defenders there and allow your team more opportunities for these corner threes. And so those are much more complementary events. Okay, so in addition to estimating these substitution parameters, we can also look at the propensities of these players to commit these individual actions. And so to just kind of give you an idea, these are some of the players that were rated the highest for some of the categories. And so what's important about these estimates is that they're measured simultaneously with the substitution parameters. And so what they're meant to do is they're meant to isolate an individual player's propensity to commit these different actions separate from the effect that their teammates are having. So for example, if you have a player like Tyson Chandler is getting a lot of rebounds on a team where there's not another strong rebounder, he's going to get a much lower rebounding rating than someone like DeAndre Jordan or Andre Drummond last year with Greg Monroe, who gets the same number of rebounds but is competing with some of those rebounds with a teammate who's also a strong rebounder. And so again, these player ratings are meant to isolate how much of a player's performance is due to that player's individual tendencies separate from the effect that the team is having on them. Okay, so then with these things, what we can do is we can then assess the value a player has taking these complementarities into account. And we can look at both how that player helps the team both through their own individual production and then how they're going to help or affect their teammates. So one thing we can do is we can assess the offensive value of different players. And we can do that by looking at how when that player enters the lineup, how they affect the expected points per possession scored by that lineup on offense. And so this is a list of the top 5 players in terms of offensive value last year. So Anthony Davis is at the top. And so what this is telling us is that when Anthony Davis enters the lineup of Tyreek Evans, Eric Gordon, Dante Cunningham, and Omer Asik, he's going to increase their expected points scored on offense by 614 ten-thousandths of a point per possession, or 6.14 points per 100 possessions. And that's including both his own individual production and how he's going to be affecting the production of those other teammates. We can also assess a player's defensive value by looking at how when that player enters the game, how do they affect, or enters a lineup, how do they affect that lineup's expected points given up on defense. And then we can combine that with the offense to get the total player value. How much when they enter that lineup are they affecting the difference between the expected points scored on offense and the expected points given up on defense. And so Marc Gasol last year was the most valuable player to his lineup according to that metric. Okay, another thing we can do is we can try to assess how much do players affect the production of their teammates, and what players helped and hurt their teammates' production by the largest amount. And so here first are the players that helped their teammates' production by the largest amount. So these are these are players that don't really take a lot of shots, and they don't command the ball very often. And so what this is telling us is that Wesley Johnson there at the top, when he enters that lineup of Jeremy Lin, Wayne Ellington, Jordan Hill, and Ed Davis, he's going to increase the production of those 4 players by about 6.1 points per 100 possession. And he's doing that mainly because he doesn't take many shots. He doesn't really command the ball. And we can see that here. So this graph is showing the difference between, I guess on your guys' right-hand side, the expected probability that a replacement player takes shots in that lineup compared to Wesley Johnson. And so this shows that Wesley Johnson is going to take less shots from pretty much every location than the player he's replacing, except that turquoise line, he's going to take more corner threes. And so that's what that's going to do to his teammates then, is that they're all going to be able to increase their shots, especially within 3 feet. And so that's going to increase their production. And so then we can look at which players decrease their teammates' production by the most, and it's these really ball-dominant players that take a lot of shots. And so what's important here is this doesn't necessarily mean like these players don't have value to their teams. So like I went pretty quick through it, but DeMarcus Cousins is actually one of the most valuable players to his lineup. But this is saying here that he actually decreases his teammates' production by about 13.5 points. And so what that's saying is that DeMarcus Cousins' value is basically all through his own individual production. When he comes into the game, he's really doing it all himself. And that's where he's going to bring that value. But he's decreasing some of the value from his teammates, or the production of his teammates. And we can see that with this graph of Russell Westbrook. So he's going to increase his shots from pretty much every location. He's going to turn the ball over more than the player he's replacing. And then that's going to mean less shots for his teammates and less production from his teammates. And so that's the effect we're picking up. We can also look at what players were helped or hurt the most individually by the teams that they played on last year. So these are the players whose individual contribution was helped the most because of the team that they played on. And so you notice of the top 5, 3 of them are Lakers. And this just brings up the point I brought up at the start that on this team, once Kobe Bryant went down, there was no real ball-dominant player on the team, and there was a lot of shots to go around. And so that helped the individual production of these players. And then we have these other players that were hurt the most by the team that they were on last year. And so what this is saying that the model predicts that Rudy Gay, if he didn't play with DeMarcus Cousins, would have taken a lot more shots. And then it's no surprise to see Kyrie Irving and Kevin Love on this list, given that they have to compete with each other for touches and compete with LeBron for touches as well. Okay. The last thing I want to do then is I then want to evaluate whether these player complementarities are taken into account in the NBA labor market in terms of a player's salary. And so I did that by regressing a player's salary on their individual offensive production, their defensive production, and then the effect they had on their teammates' production. And then I also controlled for position because players at different positions are paid different amounts. And so what I find is that players are largely solely paid for their own individual production. So if you look at the coefficient on defense, it's very, very small in magnitude. It's not statistically significant, indicating that players aren't really paid for their defensive contribution. And if we look at the coefficient on spillovers, it's negative. It's not statistically significant. And so overall, the idea is that players are basically solely paid for their own individual offensive production. And so what they do is that presents an opportunity for teams to increase their production at a lower cost if they can recognize these complementarities, possibly using a framework like the one presented here to acquire players that are better fit for their team at a lower cost. Okay, so to quickly conclude, the basic idea of this paper was to try to quantify this idea of fit by presenting this framework for identifying the substitutability between these different skills and player actions, and then using that to evaluate players based on players' tendencies to commit certain actions that might be complements with the skills of their teammates, and then how that's going to affect the value of that player. So last, some areas of improvement or some limitations of the paper. I think it could be improved a lot with more detailed player action data that allow us to get more substitutes between a wider range of player actions. I think a better job could be done assessing substitutability on the defensive end as well as the offensive end. And then I also think it'd be really interesting to think about this in terms of team strategy. So a lot of these substitution parameters have to do with the strategy the team is taking. And so I expect those things to actually differ across different teams, and it would be interesting to see how that's done. So that's it. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes for question and answer. If you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll come to you with the microphone.
So it looks like the way you have players substituting in and out is treated as random in the model, right?
Yeah.
But isn't a coach really knowing his players and making an endogenous selection about who he's going to put in and put out? Like if I take my tallest player out, I'm probably going to put in a really specific guy to fill that void?
No, I mean, I think that's definitely true. I don't think it hurts the estimation because my probabilities are conditional on the 5 players on that court. It's how likely is someone to take a shot in this location conditional on the 5 players on that court. Not taking into account that more players are getting more or less time. But I would definitely agree, like those things are endogenous. So if you're talking about a model that we're accounting for these substitution parameters, that's something that would mess up the results in that case. But yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a problem in the way that I'm going about it here.
I'm curious about the stability of this year to year. I mean, obviously you only showed the results for last year, but could it be that teams aren't actually paying for this because it isn't that predictable year to year?
No, it's definitely true. Could it be that contracts come up every so-and-so years? What is this really picking anything up? So I looked at things like just looking at the free agents this year, and the results are similar. Since I have such a small sample of free agents in that case, like the standard errors become huge, and it's that kind of thing. But I did try to mess around a little with it, so to try to see if the numbers really changed that much. And kind of any regression I ran, it really was big on this offensive contribution, and not much. I wasn't so surprised to see not much on these spillovers, but I was surprised to see not much in terms of this any kind of defensive contribution.
Hi, I was wondering if your model dealt with situations where there are players who are sort of highly coincident, like they share the floor often and they're off the floor together, so maybe your estimation of their propensity to commit certain actions is like you don't have a sample without the player that they're on the court with all the time.
Yeah, right. That could definitely be an issue with these things. For one, the players, I kind of whittled down my sample size to players that were played a lot of minutes anyway. And so those usually were players that did play with different lineups. I haven't looked exactly at that issue in particular, but I expect that more to be an issue with kind of role players that kind of come in with the same players all the time. But again, it could definitely, could be still an issue.
Did you look at all at how, say, a player's shot selection would affect a player's offensive rebounding rate or anything that moved between defense, rebounding, offense like that?
Sorry, I could barely hear.
Sorry. Did you look at all, say, if you have a team that shoots a lot of threes, how that affects offensive rebounding rate, or did you just?
Yeah, so I did. So I did where the player's rebounding rating depended on these shot locations from 8 different locations. So the 8 different locations I did, there were different rebounding possibilities from those 8 different locations. Yeah, definitely. So exactly, like 3-point shooting, there's a lot more offensive rebounding than there is from, a mid-range jumper or something like that. So yeah, that's in there. Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you noticed any kind of correlation or similarity between the outcomes that you were showing in terms of change, positive or negative in points per possession, versus a stat like RPM, offensive or defensive. And if like a player like Chris Middleton last year, he didn't have the most gaudy stats in the league, but he got rewarded with a pretty high contract due to his RPM. So is there any correlation between that? Like, how did those compare?
I haven't looked directly at it, but I think there's a high correlation between what I'm measuring as a player's individual contribution and those, like that kind of stat. And I think those things don't pick up as much as the effect that they're having on their teammates, which to some degree is a secondary effect, but that's more of what I'm trying to pick up here. But I think that the individual offensive part is something that's picked up by a lot of these other stats. Definitely.
I think we have time for one more question.
I wanted to piggyback off the last question. In the defense of Westbrook, in the lineups that he was around, he had very secondary scorers. Did you see a correlation between other primary scorers in lineups with secondary scorers?
Not directly, but like in the example with like Russell Westbrook, he's not as good of an example of this as DeMarcus Cousins, but DeMarcus Cousins does provide a lot of value to his team. It's just showing that that's he's doing it all himself when he's coming out, when he's playing there. And Russell Westbrook to some degree is doing that too. Russell Westbrook's not as efficient in terms of, and he takes more shots than maybe he should have. So he's not the best example of that, but it's not the case that these guys are bad teammates in the sense that they're providing no value to the team. It's that they're they're hurting the individual contribution of those teammates. And how much is that a bad or good thing is really up to kind of putting the whole thing together rather than just looking at that in particular.
All right, thank you. The next presentations for the other papers will begin in about 5 or 10 minutes.